What's the connection between Iranian missiles, food prices in Ohio, and chip production in Malaysia? The answer is helium. The strikes on Qatar have cut off the gas that cools your processors. Trump has 21 days left until the factories in Kuala Lumpur shut down. But he doesn't care. He already lifted sanctions on Belarus for potash to save his farm belt, effectively burying NATO. We're seeing global supply chains detonate, and this is just the beginning of the first month. Welcome to 2026, where alliances are now sold only by subscription. Operation Epic Fury doubled the scale of shock and awe from 2003. But here's the thing that caught my attention more than any missile launch. While briefing reporters, Donald Trump mentioned a very large financial gift from Iran. The press assumed a bribe. Analysts speculated about immigration visas for wealthy Iranians. Everyone was looking at the wrong ledger. Let me walk you through the ledger that actually matters. For 300 years, Lloyd's of London has controlled the global maritime insurance market. If you want to ship oil through the Strait of Hormuz, your tanker needs insurance. That insurance has historically been underwritten by syndicates sitting in the City of London. This isn't just a financial service. It is a choke point of power. Whoever controls the insurance premium controls who sails and who doesn't. If you already know about this and have heard about it in our previous videos, you can skip ahead. However, it's important to clarify for those who haven't encountered this information before. So, the gift was this. Iran agreed to pull its entire shadow financial network, offshore accounts, logistics contracts, insurance arrangements out of British jurisdiction. Simultaneously, intelligence services leaked the property empire of Mujtaba Kameh, the supreme leader's son, whose offshore nodes were woven deep into the city's fabric. Those links were severed overnight. The numbers tell the story. In a matter of weeks, an estimated $120 billion in annual maritime insurance premiums began migrating from London to Miami and Dubai. Lloyd syndicate valuations collapsed by 18%, erasing roughly $45 billion in market capitalization. The 3-century-old British monopoly on global shipping logistics didn't just crack, it shattered. This wasn't collateral damage. This was the objective. Trump has been publicly hostile to what he calls globalist financial centers. London is the oldest and the deepest. By setting Iran on fire, he smoked capital out of the city the way you smoke bees out of a hive. The famous special relationship, the strategic bond between Washington and London that survived 2 world wars, and the Cold War is now worth exactly 0. That is not my rhetoric. That is the market's verdict. And while London burned financially, something else was happening in the shadows. Let me give you 2 numbers, $210 per megawatt hour. That is the price of energy in the European Union right now, $38 per megawatt hour. That is the price in Texas, a 450% difference. That gap is not an accident. It is an architecture. When Iranian drones struck the Ras Laffan facility in Qatar, the second largest LNG exporter on Earth, Qatar Energy declared force majeure and shut down production entirely. That single event ripped 20% of global LNG supply off the market. European underground gas storage, already depleted after the brutal winter of 2025-2026, collapsed to 30% capacity. Prices on the Dutch TTF hub, Europe's benchmark, surged 40% in 2 trading sessions, blasting past 62 per megawatt hour. Goldman Sachs warned governments to prepare for a further 130% increase if the blockade lasted a month. Enter the Turnberry Agreement, conceived in July 2025 at a meeting between Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Scotland. This deal commits the European Union to purchasing $750 billion worth of American energy, primarily LNG plus oil and civilian nuclear technology through 2028. 120 billion cubic meters of gas. The EU must buy it or face economic annihilation. The European Parliament tried to fight. On March 26, 2026, they voted on ratification with defensive amendments, a sunrise clause linking tariff removal to American reciprocity on steel and aluminum. The U.S. ambassador to the EU, Andrew Pooser, responded with a single sentence that deserves to be carved into the tombstone of European strategic autonomy. We have other buyers. That is not diplomacy. That is a landlord talking to a tenant who is 3 months behind on rent. But the humiliation didn't stop there. On March 24, 2026, 2 days before the Parliament vote, something vanished from the European Commission's working agenda. The proposal for a complete phase-out of Russian oil imports by 2027 simply disappeared. No press conference, no official statement. It was removed like a line item from a budget nobody wants to discuss. Europe capitulated to reality. Caught between the American energy monopoly and the Russian alternative, Brussels chose to keep both doors open. Principles of sanctioned solidarity were quietly sacrificed on the altar of physical survival. To avoid freezing, Europe must now run to either Trump or Putin. Those are the only two doors in the room, and neither one leads to sovereignty. For Germany specifically, this is existential. Energy prices for German industry had already spiked 32% in the first half of 2023. By March 2026, we are no longer discussing recession. We are discussing structural deindustrialization. Factories are not pausing production. They are relocating to Texas, to the Gulf states, to anywhere the lights stay on for less than $200 per megawatt hour. The European Central Bank was forced to act on March 19th. It canceled its planned interest rate cut, raised inflation projections for 2026, and slashed GDP growth forecasts. Economists are now using a term I haven't heard applied to Western Europe in my career: structural collapse. Without resumed Middle Eastern imports or full capitulation to Turnberry's terms, the EU is heading into a deep technical recession. The locomotive of European industry is running out of fuel, literally. Now follow the chain. The Strait of Hormuz is blocked. 1 million tons of urea, the nitrogen fertilizer that feeds half the world's crops, is sitting in cargo holds going nowhere. Global nitrogen prices have risen 77%. American farmers in Ohio, Iowa, and Kansas are staring at planting season with fertilizer costs they cannot absorb. Trump needs their votes, and fertilizer requires potash. 20% of the world's potash comes from one country, Belarus. So Trump made a deal. He lifted sanctions on Belarus Scaly, the Belarusian state potash monopoly, in exchange for the release of approximately 250 political prisoners and direct potash shipments to the United States. In a single transaction, he nullified the entire European sanctions framework against the Lukashenko regime. Years of coordinated Western pressure from Poland, Lithuania, and the Baltic states gone, overwritten by the price of bread. The message to allies is not subtle. It is arithmetic. Your democratic principles are worth less than my spring planting season. Food security has now officially replaced political alliances as the operating system of American foreign policy. And if you think that's cynical, wait until you see what the missiles are doing to the global chip supply. The military math of epic fury contains a problem that nobody in the Pentagon wants to discuss publicly. The United States is spending approximately $120 billion per month on this operation. A single Tomahawk cruise missile costs around $2 million. An Iranian Shahed drone costs roughly $20,000. Every time the U.S. shoots one down with a missile, that is a 100-to-1 cost ratio in Iran's favor. The American response comes in two forms. First, Lucas, a mass-reduced American clone drone priced at approximately $35,000 per unit, designed to match swarm tactics with swarm tactics. Second, and more consequential, the Leonidas system, a high-powered microwave weapon that can disable up to 49 drones in a single electromagnetic pulse at a cost per shot that rounds to nearly zero. But here is the hidden crisis. Nobody is connecting to the war. The strikes on Qatar didn't just shut down LNG, they shut down helium production. Qatar is one of the world's largest helium suppliers, and helium is not a party balloon gas. It is an irreplaceable coolant in semiconductor manufacturing. Malaysia controls 13% of the global chip testing and packaging market. Without helium, fabrication plants in Kuala Lumpur have a 21-day buffer before production grinds to a halt. 21 days, that is the distance between epic fury and a global electronic shortage that raises the price of every phone, laptop, and car on the planet. Follow the chain again. Strike on Iran, helium shutdown in Qatar, chip shortage in Malaysia, rising iPhone prices in New York. That is not a war. That is a supply chain detonation. Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has reportedly begun emergency consultations with semiconductor companies about helium stockpile alternatives. There are none that can be deployed in 21 days. The world's most advanced technology depends on a noble gas that most people associate with birthday balloons, and the supply just got cut off by a war that has nothing to do with semiconductors, or so we are told. The G7 meeting in France at the Abbaye de Dévaux outside Paris, March 26th to 27th, ended without a joint communiqué. Let that sink in. The Group of Seven, the institutional backbone of the Western liberal order since 1975, could not produce a single page of agreed text. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived late, skipping the first day entirely for consultations on the Iran file. The Europeans wanted clarity on American war aims. They received silence. The communiqué was canceled specifically to avoid publishing the internal fractures for the world to see. Without a document, there was nowhere to mention Ukraine. The Ukrainian crisis, supposedly the defining issue of European security, was swallowed whole by the panic over Hormuz and the Turnberry ultimatum. Meanwhile, the real diplomacy was happening elsewhere in Muscat, at the Al-Alam Palace, in Islamabad, in Geneva. The key negotiators were not European foreign ministers. They were Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, Pakistani Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif, Pakistani Army Chief Field Marshal Aim Munir, who spoke directly with Trump on March 23rd, Iranian Representative Ali Larijani from the Supreme National Security Council. Pakistan, a nuclear state with deep ties to both Washington and Tehran, has become the primary mediator in the most consequential geopolitical crisis of the decade. A 15-point ceasefire plan originated in Washington was transmitted to Tehran through Islamabad, not through London, not through Paris, not through Berlin. Turkey, under Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan, positions itself as the industrial bridge between the warring camps, manufacturing for both sides, profiting from both sides, allied with neither. Egypt tightens its grip on the Suez Canal, the last southern choke point still nominally functioning. The keys to the region are no longer held by Western democracies. They are held by nuclear-armed intermediaries, industrial opportunists, and canal gatekeepers. NATO is not at the table. It is in the museum, and the Europeans know it. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and German Chancellor Friedrich Merz issued an unprecedented joint statement distancing themselves from American strikes. Britain initially refused to allow the U.S. to use its bases on Cyprus for offensive operations against Iran, limiting cooperation to defensive missile interception only. Trump's response was instantaneous and ruthless. Britain and France were formally excluded from the new Middle Eastern security architecture. The head of the French armed forces publicly stated that America's own unpredictability had become the primary destabilizing element in the international system for all allies and Ukraine. In Miami on March 21st, the Ukrainian delegation, Security Council Secretary Rustem Umerov, Military Intelligence Chief Kirilo Budanov, Parliamentary faction leader Davidid Arakhamia sat across from Witkoff Kushner and advisor Josh Grunbaum. Not a single Pentagon general, not a single State Department career diplomat. The discussion centered not on military victory or offensive weapons, but on security guarantees and the humanitarian component of ending the war. That is the language of managed capitulation. Ukraine's credit default swap probability stands at 95%. Reports from the Miami meeting suggest discussion of transferring 50% of Ukraine's lithium and titanium mining rights to American funds in exchange for extending credit lines. Ukraine is no longer an ally being defended. It is a distressed asset being stripped for parts. China is watching and buying. Iran's so-called ghost fleet, aging tankers with identification systems deliberately switched off, conducting ship-to-ship transfers in open water, continues to move east. Beijing is purchasing Iranian crude at a 40% discount, $55 per barrel, against a global benchmark of 95. China is an energy hostage by design, but a patient one. It is waiting for the United States to exhaust itself militarily and financially, then intends to collect the pieces. India, by contrast, is in shock. Pakistan's sudden elevation to primary U.S. mediator has upended New Delhi's strategic calculations. India is losing an estimated $40 billion annually from elevated oil prices, while watching its regional rival gain direct access to the American president's ear. The drift toward BRICS and away from Washington accelerates with every phone call between Trump and Assam Munir. Trump is using Pakistan to discipline India for what Washington considers excessive strategic independence. The message neutrality is not free. In this new system, you are either a subscriber or a target. Meanwhile, Iran's oil production remarkably still runs at roughly 3.3 million barrels per day. Exports of crude and condensate have collapsed by 67% since the start of operations, and dirty petroleum product exports have cratered by 75%. But the ghost fleet adapts. Tehran offers unprecedented discounts to keep its remaining customers loyal, and the revenue that survives flows directly into the IRGC's war machine, funding proxy operations across Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. The war feeds itself. Now pull back to the map. The Suez Canal was already under stress from Houthi attacks in 2024. The Strait of Hormuz is now a war zone. 21 commercial vessels attacked, clusters of ships frozen on both sides, afraid to transit. The southern energy corridors that powered the 20th century are on fire. There is one route left, the Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast. It is 40% shorter than the Suez Passage, and it is increasingly navigable because the glaciers are melting. Trump offered Denmark $2 trillion, including defense guarantees, for Greenland. The island sits on an estimated 25% of the world's undiscovered Arctic resources, including rare earth minerals that are the only insurance policy against Chinese dominance of the electronic supply chain. This is not irrational. This is geometry. If the South is burning, the North becomes the only corridor. If you control Greenland, you control the entry point to Arctic logistics. If you negotiate with Russia on Northern CW route access, you control the corridor itself. The South doesn't need to be permanently destroyed. It just needs to be unreliable enough that the world has no choice but to use your northern alternative. Trump is not merely reacting to a crisis. He is engineering a geographical monopoly. Set the South on fire. Make the North the only safe passage. Own the toll booth. Climate change isn't a threat in this calculus. It is an opportunity. Melting glaciers are opening a safe that contains the next century's logistics infrastructure. The irony is perfect and deliberate. The same administration that withdrew from climate agreements is now profiting from the consequences of climate inaction. The ice melts, the route opens, the rare earths become accessible, and the old choke points, Suez, Hormuz, Malaa, become expensive, dangerous relics of a previous era. So what are we looking at? The United States is no longer the world's policeman. It is the world's collector. The missiles overthrown are real, but they are also a smoke screen. Behind them, a different operation is underway, the dismantling of every multilateral structure that once constrained American power and their replacement with bilateral subscription agreements, energy subscriptions, security subscriptions, food subscriptions. The Turnberry Agreement is not a trade deal. It is a protection racket denominated in liquefied natural gas. The City of London has lost its 300-year insurance monopoly. Europe faces deindustrialization or vassalage. Ukraine is being converted from an ally into collateral. NATO cannot produce a communiqué. The G7 cannot produce consensus. The UN was not mentioned once in any of the diplomatic tracks I've documented. The old world ran on shared values, or at least the performance of shared values. The new world runs on physical resources: potash, lithium, helium, LNG, rare earth metals. The only currency that matters now is something you can put on a ship. And the only question that matters is whose ship and through whose strait. I've been analyzing conflicts for over 10 years. I've seen regime changes packaged as liberation, invasions packaged as peacekeeping, and economic warfare packaged as sanctions. But I have never seen anything on this scale. An operation that simultaneously wages a shooting war in the Persian Gulf, bankrupts the financial capital of a historic ally, forces an entire continent into energy dependency, and restructures global logistics around a melting ice cap. This is not an American victory. This is an American survival mechanism that operates by consuming its own alliance system. And the question that should keep every analyst, every policymaker, and every citizen awake tonight is not whether this strategy will work. The question is, who is next in line for the audit? Because the auditor is no longer pretending to be your friend. He is reading your balance sheet and he already knows what you're